Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being with us today for our book talk, Will China Save the Planet? Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Dean's Office for their support and our co-sponsors, the East Asian Legal Studies, the Environmental Law Society, and the Harvard China Project. Copies of today's book are on sale outside of the room, so after the talk, please buy a copy. It's a really great book. And I want to let you know that our talk and the Q&A period is being recorded, so you're on notice for that, and the talk will be available on the law school's YouTube channel sometime next week. And so it's my pleasure to, I didn't know I was doing this, but to introduce Professor Lazarus, who's going to introduce our author. So I'll pass it off to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is a real treat for me to introduce Barbara Finamore. Barbara is currently the Senior Strategic Director for Asia for Natural Resources Defense Council. She has been active in environmental public interest organizations and a lot of time with NRDC for 30 plus years at this point. A particular relevance to the topic she's talking about today, her book. Barbara established in 1996 the first office for NRDC in Beijing, China. And that was the first international NGO office anywhere in China at that point. Barbara, in 2017, was named by Foreign Policy Magazine part of the U.S.-China 50. Those are the 50 individuals most important in powering what's called the most complex and consequential relationship in the world right now. But my ties to Barbara go back to 1976, when we were law school classmates here at Harvard Law School. We met each other in the Environmental Law Society then. And I also see Bob Ruxin, who is a classmate of ours here, as well as joined the audience. Although Barbara and Bob were Section 1. They were not Section 4 in my section. But our interest in environmental law sort of forged a friendship back in 1976, and Barbara and I have crisscrossed professional and personal circles ever since then. And this is just her latest achievement. So I'm really delighted Barbara's here and want to welcome her at Harvard Law School.
Thank you, Professor Lazarus. It is such an honor to have you here. I have been following his distinguished career for decades. And thank you to the East Asian Legal Studies program, the Harvard Law School Environmental Law Society, and the Harvard China Project on Energy, Economy, and Environment. It's my pleasure to be with you all today. Thanks for spending the time. When I first moved to China in 1990, winter meant coal. Every year on November 15th, regardless of the weather, the government turned on the central heating system powered by coal. The skies turned dark and our faces were covered with soot. And I remember people pedaling their three-wheelers filled with coal back to their homes to use for heating and cooling. I remember that distinctly because one day, one of them ran right into me, my car, which was one of the only private cars on the streets at that time. And he had no brakes, so he just powered down the hill and, my goodness, wasn't expecting a private car there. And in the distance was 4 major coal-fired power plants and the largest steel plant in the country, all of which are gone now, but not the pollution. Following year, I witnessed the emergence of China on the international climate stage. This was at a conference they had called of 40 developing countries at this ballroom at the elegant Kunlun Hotel. I actually snuck into that conference and was very glad I did, because this was the moment when the developing countries first came together under China's leadership to develop a set of negotiating principles, many of which were incorporated into the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. And these principles strongly reflected China's own negotiating priorities, which really were negotiating among various central government ministries. But the ones who won out were the Foreign Policy Ministry, and they were protect China's national interest, preserve its state sovereignty, and enhance its international image. So I was then in Copenhagen in 2009 when Premier Wen Jiabao took most of the blame, at least in the West, for the failure to reach a binding global climate change treaty. But China's top priority was preserving these principles, particularly one of common but differentiated responsibilities for developed and developing countries. They did not want to be singled out for special treatment, even though at that time, China had already become the world's second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And why is that? Because following China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, China experienced an economic boom that was unprecedented in human history. It quadrupled its gross national product, it nearly quintupled its exports, and it was powered by coal, so it tripled its coal consumption, building on average one new coal-fired power plant a week to power its heavy industry and manufacturing facilities. So this is another form of the hockey stick graph that you may know about from climate change, and funny how it parallels China's own CO2 emissions, because in 2006, China overtook the US as the leading emitter of climate change, even though it's important to note that its per capita emissions then and now still lag far behind those of the United States. And China's coal consumption is responsible for about 80% of its energy-related CO2 emissions. In fact, China's coal consumption is the single largest source of CO2 emissions in the world, 7 billion tons per year. That's more than the total emissions of any other country. So following the Copenhagen summit, it just seemed like there was no way to reconcile the fundamental differences that were so vividly on display there, especially between the US and China. Yet, only a few years later, the US and China were signing a series of joint agreements on climate change that played a fundamental role in reaching the Paris Climate Agreement and in hastening the speed at which it entered into force. So what changed between Copenhagen and Paris? That's just 5-6 years. Well, beginning in the mid-2000s, China began to realize that its single-minded focus on GDP growth was no longer enough to ensure a better way of life for its citizens. So its development model was not sustainable, and it left a trail of environmental impacts in its wake: air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, the list goes on, desertification, loss of biodiversity, all beyond the scope of my book, but I could fill up many other volumes. But the real turning point, I believe, happened in 2013, the year of China's so-called airpocalypse, when a weeks-long bout of severe air pollution across northern China demonstrated unmistakably that the country was choking on its high-speed, unbalanced development. People wore face masks to go outside. My Beijing office assigned a face mask to every staff member. Hospital admissions soared. People were dying at the estimated rate of 4,000 people a day, as if every man, woman, and child in China was smoking 1 0.5 cigarettes an hour. So public concern about air pollution soared, especially as the public got access to more information about what was in what they thought was just fog and what was the impact on their public health. This was the turning point because coal was the source of both the CO2 emissions and China's air, the main source of CO2 emissions and its choking pollution. So by the end of 2013, the government had pledged 1.7 trillion renminbi to clean up the air and developed a national air pollution control action plan focusing on cutting coal consumption in each of its major polluted areas, and a host of other policies, programs, incentives, funding, and so forth. So the result of this coal campaign, air pollution campaign, really was quite impressive, as you can see here. Once it joined the WTO, China was tripling its coal consumption. It went up again after the 2008 worldwide economic crisis due to China's stimulus. But for once, starting in 2013 and continuing for the next 3 years, China's coal consumption actually dropped. And that was significant because during those 3 years, global CO2 emissions actually stabilized, even as the world economy continued to grow. But it's not that easy. China's coal consumption began to rise again in 2017. We're waiting for the numbers for this year, but probably likely to go up again. Again, one key factor anyway, seems to be an economic stimulus again, as China's economy continues to slow, and also as a result, in part, of the trade wars between the US and China. But the stimulus is focused on infrastructure, again, which means more production in iron and steel, more pollution, more CO2 emissions. And also, recent satellite imagery shows that local governments don't always do what China asked. We have this saying in China, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. And despite this raft of measures to actually red light, stop production of new coal plants in 15 provinces in China, we found that they're continuing to be built anyway. This has stalled China's transition to a cleaner energy economy. However, studies show that none of these new coal plants are needed, especially as the economy slows down. Stimulus no longer gives China the same bang for the buck as it did perhaps in 2008. And so according to Greenpeace, even though China has moved from a situation where it was building one new coal-fired power plant a week to where it's building one new idle coal-fired power plant a week. And these plants are losing money. Half of China's coal plants were losing money in the first half of last year. So China faces unprecedented challenges. What it needs to do, just really quick, these are the kind of things that my organization is working to help China move towards stronger enforcement of its mandatory national coal cap, changing rural residents from coal to gas or electric heating, strong power plant standards, strong environmental enforcement, its new permit system, and the launch of what may become the world's largest carbon trading market. And I would say that China should also consider phasing out its fossil fuel subsidies, which along with those of the US are the world's largest. As I'll tell you in a minute, they are in the process of phasing out subsidies for renewable energy and for electric vehicles. And so to provide a level playing field, that's the way to go, phase out the coal-fired subsidies as well. So speaking of renewable energy, following the Copenhagen summit, another major change in China's development model was its beginning realization that clean energy provides the largest market opportunity of the 21st century. So 10 years ago, China was already the largest producer and exporter of solar panels, but it had almost no domestic industry. But when the 2008 world crisis started, countries like Germany, who provided heavy subsidies to solar panels, stopped them, and China was left with a glut of solar panels. It had to develop its own domestic market, which it did with a national feed-in tariff, with a Golden Sun roofs program, and really a detailed plan to develop its domestic solar power industry from nothing to where we are today. And again, in 2013, that tipping point year, China became the leading investor in renewable energy. 126 billion last year, another 360 billion by 2020, and an estimated 6 trillion by 2030. For every dollar that the US invested in renewable energy last year, China invested 3. So as a result, China now leads the world in solar and wind capacity. And it also leads the world in clean energy jobs, expecting that this new investment will generate 13 million more new energy jobs, clean energy jobs, by 2020. In 2017, China installed as much solar power as existed globally in 2014. That was half of all the new solar panel installed worldwide. In fact, and this is key, China installed more solar power in 2017 than any other energy source, including coal. So my favorite image comes from Anhui province, which recently turned on the world's largest floating solar power plant over a collapsed coal mine. And I couldn't help but show you this one. Very cute. Last year, the first half of last year, China installed another 24 gigawatts of solar PV capacity, roughly equal to the entire solar capacity of India to date. And its 2020 solar target, which it has already revised upward 3 or 4 times, will give it 5 times the solar power capacity of the United States. China now also has 1 out of every 3 wind turbines in the world. And meeting its Paris Accord pledge will require China to increase the share of its non-fossil energy in its energy mix to 20% by 2030. This would involve adding enough non-fossil energy to equal the entire US electricity system of any kind. And that's not enough for China. There's talk that they're going to increase the percentage of renewable energy, non-fossil, to 35%. But the country still faces tremendous challenges as it works to integrate renewable energy into a system and an economy that was built on coal. It's not as easy as it looks. Much of that renewable energy is currently being wasted or curtailed due to regional imbalances, the grid inflexibility, and the need for cost-effective, reliable storage solutions. So China's in the process, as it has been for many years, of reforming its power sector. It's also investing heavily in battery storage options. They add as much battery storage production capability last year as in all previous years combined. They're not building Tesla-like battery factories or battery gigafactories, battery gigacities. That's what's going on in China right now. But I had to say, China's NGOs are stepping in to help. And one of the oldest Chinese NGOs, the Friends of Nature, brought 2 lawsuits in 2016 against 2 utilities in provinces that are suffering some of the worst curtailment rates in China. And they are seeking damages, in one case nearly 50 million US, for the utilities' failure to compensate renewable energy generators that were curtailed as required by China's renewable energy law. So watch this space. Another major step in China's transformation from climate resistor to climate leader also occurred in, guess when? 2013, the year of the air apocalypse. In September of that year, the same year that China launched its National Air Pollution Control Plan, it also launched what is the world's largest electric vehicle promotion project. They have created the world's largest electric vehicle market through what the Wall Street Journal calls sheer force of will, and also massive subsidies, investment in R&D, preferential treatment by central and local governments, and most recently, requirements for any foreign or local automaker who wishes to work in China, sell cars in China, to make sure that a certain percentage of their automobiles are new energy vehicles. And this was largely due to the efforts of one of the people that I most admire in China, Wan Gan. I met him when he was an automotive engineer in Shanghai, coming back from Germany with a vision of how China can cut its energy dependence on oil and its pollution and grab a market that had been bypassed by the United States, clean energy vehicles. He became the Minister of Science and Technology and oversaw this new energy vehicle program, which has transformed the landscape of the global automotive industry, not just China's. China will spend an estimated $60 billion on subsidies for these new energy vehicles just between 2015 and 2020. That's 10 times the amount of the US. And China is also working on a timetable to completely phase out the internal combustion engine, following the lead of a number of other countries and providing critical momentum to that effort. So China has now overtaken the US as the world's largest electric vehicle market. Energy sales, that was 2017. Last year they doubled again, and they're expected to double again in 2019. China is now home to 40% of the world's electric vehicles and 99% of its electric buses. It also has 50% of the world's electric vehicle charging infrastructure and 75% of all its battery manufacturing infrastructure. But there's always challenges in China, and they're very similar in many respects to what other countries are facing. How to expand and improve the charging network, how to get consumers to accept electric vehicles when they're not sure how long they will be able to drive before the battery runs out. And this is real. I was one of those who just bought an electric vehicle at the end of last year to get a tax break, so I know what that's like. But when I ask, what is China a leader in the climate movement, to me, what is most fascinating, that it's not just about what China is doing to cut its own CO2 emissions, to profit from clean energy sales, and to cut its own pollution and energy independence. What's important to me is how the scale and scope of China's production facilities of these clean energy technologies has brought down the price so that every other country in the world can afford solar energy, wind energy, and electric vehicles. Solar and wind, the cost of new facilities has dropped by 80% in the last decade. And some predict that solar could become the cheapest energy resource in as little as 5 years. Wind is already the cheapest resource in some markets. I never thought I would see the day. China is now entering a difficult phase where it's trying, as I said before, to phase out those massive subsidies. And because the price is getting so low that they think we're close to the point where they can compete with coal on their own. And some experts say that we're reaching the point where it will be cheaper to build a new solar or wind plant than to buy coal for an existing coal plant. That's the tipping point. That's the transformation, and it's already happening. Global Carbon Tracker says that 42% of the world's coal fleet is already losing money. That'll rise to 96% by 2030. And they say a least cost power system without coal should be seen as an economic inevitability. And the same is true for electric vehicles. The cost of the battery is something along the lines of 30% of the cost of an electric vehicle. China's massive production has brought that cost down by 2/3 in only 5 years. And it's expected to continue dropping 15 to 20% a year to the point where electric vehicles, which believe me are pretty expensive right now, can become competitive with conventional gasoline engines within 8 to 10 years. Electric buses, remember China has 99% of them right now, are already cheaper than their conventional alternatives everywhere. I read just recently a lot of concerned articles saying that auto sales have been dropping in China, in the US, and that is true the past couple of months. However, the sales of electric vehicles are just booming, even as the sales of the conventional autos are dropping. Electric vehicle sales last month were up 138%. I see this as a sign. The transition is already beginning. But here's the real problem, the real question. Can we move fast enough to avoid climate disaster? Of course, Donald Trump famously called climate change a hoax developed by the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. But the surge in the catastrophic hurricanes, in the flooding, in the raging wildfires make the truth impossible to ignore. Climate change is real, and it is happening now. And the latest report from the UN Scientific Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is an unprecedented wake-up call that we must act now to have CO2 emissions in 10 to 12 years to avoid climate change impacts to reach climate change impacts that are mostly survivable. To do so will require a dramatic shift away from fossil fuels and a fundamental transformation of the world economy. Otherwise, according to other reports, the early warnings show compound and overwhelming impacts if temperatures continue to rise, impacts that will threaten both human lives and dwarf the ability of our health systems to respond. So I would argue that thanks in large part to the size of China's investments, including R&D, we are on a path to move from a system that is 2/3 fossil fuel right now to one that is 2/3 or 50%, some say 2/3 renewable energy by 2050. But the IPCC says we have to get to 85% renewable energy. We have to, by 2050, we have to essentially electrify everything, dramatically improve energy efficiency, and pretty much phase out coal. That's renewable energy investment would have to increase at a pace 6 times what we're doing now. And you heard what I just said about how fast it's moving. And similarly with electric vehicles, right now, they constitute a little over 4% of the market for global automobiles. But again, thanks to China's efforts, and this is a form of climate leadership, we are on a path to where we could reach 50% electric vehicle fleet by 2050. But again, that's not enough. It's not enough. The IPCC says we have to reach at least 65% of all transport to be zero or no emissions by 2050. How do we get there? Well, money. The estimate is that we must invest, we as a planet, $2.4 trillion in clean energy every year between now and 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Governments can't provide all this funding, so the private sector has to step up. And here's another person. When I talk about individual leadership, many people think China is a monolithic society and government, but there are individuals like this one. Dr. Ma Jun, who's been termed Mr. Climate Finance. He has made an incredible difference in leading the world in the development of a green finance system, the world's first comprehensive green finance system for China, and also launching the green bond market, which in 2 years became the world's largest. He was instrumental in getting the G20 to adopt principles for green finance worldwide, which need to be adopted now. Enforcement, always a key issue. And the UN has named him a UN advisor on sustainable finance. Here's a Green Bank conference we just held in China. And his role is not only to turn existing thinking into action, but to help dream up new initiatives for green finance. Well, the challenges to green finance are similar to what you see for any kind of environmental issue in China. Problems with weak standards and difficulties in getting information to ensure strong monitoring and verification. But there's another Ma Jun in China you may have heard of, China's leading environmental activist, who is working with China's Green Finance Committee because his NGO develops very significant databases of publicly available government information, and he's sharing them with China's Green Finance Committee and with green banks, so they have a way of monitoring corporations' environmental compliance to see if they are worthy of these green financial instruments. But a key question is whether China is going to apply its own innovative green finance principles in its investments overseas, as well as domestically, particularly with this Belt and Road Initiative, which was also launched in 2013. This has I think it already is considered the world's largest investment project. As you can see, more than 70 countries, 2/3 of the population, and including China, these countries are responsible for 60% of the world's global CO2 emissions. So China's actions in financing infrastructure in the Belt and Road countries will be instrumental in determining whether these countries can meet their own Paris climate emissions or lock in high emissions for decades to come. So China has exported about $8 billion of solar equipment to BRI countries in 2017. That automatically made them the world's largest exporter of environmental goods and services, but that was dwarfed by China's investment in fossil fuel infrastructure in these BRI countries. So 36% of the 51 billion spent to date on electric power went to fossil fuel, went to coal. Only 11% on solar and wind. That is 1/4 of the global coal-fired capacity under development outside of China. And some of it is ultra super critical, highly energy efficient, but there's also a lot of coal infrastructure that is subcritical and supercritical, which is highly polluting. And there's no ability to capture CO2 emissions for any of these plants. So President Xi has called for a green and low carbon Belt and Road. And more recently, in the climate negotiations last December, China's chief climate negotiator said that that China would comply with the most advanced technologies, but the guidelines that are in place are still only voluntary. There's very little oversight and monitoring, and even though we hear that China may be developing some mandatory guidelines, enforcement is still going to be the key. So China has every reason to promote a green and low carbon Belt and Road, including the fact that it is one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And it can profit and enhance its international image, one of its chief priorities, by bringing its extensive experience and best practices in clean energy technologies and policies and programs to these BRI countries. And there are huge opportunities. The World Resources Institute just estimated that there are 70 countries looking to improve their infrastructure, and that will cost in total about $6 trillion. And they don't want old infrastructure. They want modern, resilient, and clean infrastructure. And of those countries, 31 have provided detailed pledges under the Paris Accord. And to fulfill those pledges alone will require about $470 billion just in renewable energy. So here's just some things that China can do to really put some teeth into its plans and proposal to green the Belt and Road Initiative. I won't go into them here. There's also some ideas of what the Belt and Road recipient countries can do to direct those financial flows towards clean and green investments. And I have to laugh because when I started working in China with NRDC over 20 years ago, these are exactly the kind of things that we were proposing to China. So in conclusion, oh boy, the US and China are the two largest CO2 emitters. Now that Trump has announced that he plans to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, does that mean that China is stepping forward? Well, to answer that question, as explained in my book, requires an understanding of the country's complex economic and political context, the formidable obstacles it faces, and the many often powerful stakeholders that are slowing down progress, just like most other countries. But one thing is eminently clear: China is uniquely positioned and has already begun to influence the speed and scale of the world's clean energy revolution, whether speeding it up or slowing it down. But time is running out. And regardless of the answer, there is plenty of room and even need for every country to accelerate their efforts, collaborate, and even engage in healthy competition. Trade wars are in no country's best interest. But every country needs to step up its ambition. States, provinces, cities, businesses, universities, and individuals all have crucial roles to play in speeding up the transition away from fossil fuels. Leadership matters. So I founded NRDC's China program 20 years ago. Here's our office in Beijing. And right now, our 50-person office is involved in helping China make that transition on a whole range of climate, clean energy, pollution, health, wildlife, and natural resource issues, just like we're doing in the US. Here's our team. And I want to close with this. Here's the latest message, loud and clear, from these climate reports. Every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. Every choice matters. Every person matters. So I hope you'll join me and NRDC in pressing every country, region, city, and investor to accelerate its climate efforts, phase out fossil fuel subsidies, divest from fossil fuels, reduce your carbon footprint. So read my book, happy to sign it, and let's save the planet together. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. My name is Stephen. I'm a first year here at the law school. My question touches on China's economic and environmental domestic challenge, which might have global implications. So I have relatives in Shanxi province in northern China, and they have been traditionally reliant on the coal industry. And when I go visit them during Chinese New Year, I see not only my relatives, but hundreds of thousands who don't have work anymore. And this obviously has ripple effects socially and across, and we see in some ways some echoes to what we see in the U.S. So my question is, what advice you might have for whether it's a government policy and as well other actors like NGOs in addressing this issue, because I do feel if we want to tackle the global problems, especially this in terms of their own individual economic transition and lives, or these economics effects for these displaced regions will have certainly implications for the global questions. Thank you.
You've put your finger on one of the key challenges that face both China and the US in making this transition. Even though China is leading the world in developing new clean energy jobs, that doesn't mean that the people who have been working in the coal mines, in the coal power plants, in the iron and steel plants are able or willing to make that transition to those clean energy jobs. China recognizes this. It did set aside a fund of some $15 billion to help train workers to make that transition, which I think is important. However, reportedly, most of that money has been used to pay back wages from state-owned enterprises that just are underwater with debt. So addressing China's debt problem is going to be key to addressing the fundamental underlying problem. But, I feel like there's other policies that China has in the books where people in, your family's hometown and others can participate. And one of them is green buildings. The 13th five-year plan has a new policy that by 2020, 50% of all new buildings in the country must be certified green. How do you get that? These are jobs that people can learn and do, and they're available in every city. And there's also pilot projects to renovate schools, hospitals, malls, apartment buildings. And many cities have gone farther than the central government's pledge. That's where the money should be going, to train people to take on new jobs like that. But it's not easy. And this is one area where I think the US and China can learn a lot from each other, because they both face that very difficult challenge.
Barbara, thank you so much. I thought this was great. I like the nuance in showing what China's accomplishing, but let me press you a little bit on a couple of the challenges. So you mentioned the great and impressive and spectacular growth of solar capacity and exporting from China, wind, et cetera. I'm certainly not a believer in trade wars, but the argument has been made that because of the pricing of these items coming from China, it's essentially knocked out capability in Germany or the US or elsewhere to develop other ways, local industry, domestic industry that would achieve the same. And is there a danger of that globally, that there's going to be, in effect, less innovation if everything's coming from one source, and then if relations, China and the West on other grounds, deteriorate, is that a problem? And then secondly, and again, I want to give full credit. The book is terrific. You should all buy it. I bought 3 copies to give friends. But in China also, civil society, when it comes to raising issues and monitoring enforcement, which is, you said, is uneven, and holding the government to its promises, doesn't obviously have the robustness it would in a democratic society. Think of the movie Under the Dome, or one could name many other things about limits on civil society. How do you see that playing in? It's a little bit like Stephen's question. All this, you know, it must be seen in a context. So again, yes, congratulations on a wonderful book that everyone should buy, but I want to push you on those dimensions.
Also 2 very good questions. And so I agree with you. I don't think it's healthy for one country to corner the market in any of these clean technologies, whether it be solar, wind, or electric vehicle batteries. I think the U.S. dropped the ball on this. The U.S. invented the solar cell and built the first practical electric vehicle. The U.S. still has, I believe, a lead in innovation, because we need to develop new technologies, not just the cheapest ones that are already being mass produced in China. But that requires investment in R&D, and that's been cut substantially. However, I don't think, so China, I think there is some benefit for these trade negotiations, because I think China has given some ground in the electric vehicle space. It's opening up the market to foreign automakers without having to set up a joint venture, for example. But the solar tariffs that the Trump administration put on Chinese solar panels, it really backfired. I don't think the U.S. really wants to develop solar manufacturing at the scale of China, which is what brings the cost down, because those solar plants are typically 4 times the size of those in the United States. And they come with their own environmental problems. And so similarly with rare earth mining and so forth. But because of China's, bringing the cost down, the solar industry has become one of the fastest growing job creators in the United States. And it's not manufacturing, it's solar panel sales, solar panel installation, solar panel maintenance. This job of solar installer was the fastest growing in the United States until Trump slapped the tariffs on the solar panels. Luckily, the cost continues to go down, and so the impact of the tariffs is mitigated. But it is complicated, and I can't cover it all here. But yes, I do believe there's room for both countries to allow more healthy competition and cooperation, and maybe the trade talks will bring that. On your other question, near and dear to my heart, the role of Chinese NGOs. It's difficult right now. We worked very hard to support China's amendment of its bedrock environmental protection law in 2015, which sets up a whole system for Chinese NGOs to bring public interest litigation against violators. And there was hope that it would lead to this wave of litigation, but there are severe challenges that these NGOs face. Lack of funding, courts that don't want to take cases, even though the laws bend over backwards, I think, compared to what our civil procedure situation and litigation is here. But they're carrying on. They are carrying on, and that's why I think groups like Mahjun's IPE working with us is making a tremendous amount of difference, and we will continue to work. The key thing is not just funding for these NGOs, but environmental information and disclosure. And we just reported, issued a report with his organization, our 10th annual report on how well 300 cities in China are providing environmental information disclosure. And that name and shame process has led to quite some improvements, not like we would hope to see. But interestingly enough, China's own efforts to set up a new system of litigation for the procuratorate is making a big difference as well, and they're working together to support NGOs, and I'm getting very good reports about that from my colleagues. And also this kind of spot check system, SWAT teams that China's central government is sending to respond to citizen complaints in cities around the country is making a difference, and they are starting to resolve some serious long-standing environmental problems such that the government's now looking at making that SWAT team system, it's not a system here, the one-off SWAT teams into a system that can, so the NGOs in China are not strong enough to make that kind of difference that we can here in the US, but interestingly enough, they're working with government in ways that are very productive.
I'm George Mocray. I've been publishing a free weekly listing of energy and other events around Cambridge, Mass. For about a decade, so I've been following this for a long time. Another country that people say may have saved the planet, actually human beings, the planet will be great without us, is Germany, right? Because Germany primed the pump that allowed China to develop the production capacity. Are there bilateral talks between the Chinese and the Germans around things like the German Energiewende? And are they working together to deal with these problems?
Yes, despite the Trump administration canceling of our entire program of climate cooperation, the Climate Change Working Group, collaboration is still going on between many countries in China, including in the EU, including in Germany. I was at a conference in Berlin last year. There is a China Institute there that is working very closely. It's an advisor to the government. It's not the government itself, but they provide a lot of thought leadership for the German government, and they brought a lot of government officials and experts from China to Germany to talk about how to step up collaboration between those two countries. So that will go on. There was an effort, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, EU-wide, to sign an MOU with China and the EU that was very progressive and forward-thinking, but it kind of got lost in the weeds of the issue of electric vehicle subsidies and so on like that, so it never was actually signed. But there's a lot of potential there.
Barbara. My name is Chris Nielsen, as Barbara knows. I'm from the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, where we have a long-standing research program on a lot of the issues discussed in Barbara's book. And I want to have a little personal aside here that for a long time, I was kind of I felt like I had to make a lot of the same arguments that you're making in this book, that China deserves a lot more credit than it gets for efforts on environment. Whether or not the results were as good as expected. But actually, since Donald Trump was elected, sometimes I find myself taking the opposite position. And I think it's associated with that. People are looking for a global leader on climate and environment, partly because the US has withdrawn so much. And so I feel like I have to say, well, yeah, China's doing a lot, but it remains in a lot of ways an environmentally devastated country. It has a long, long, long way to go in many, many, many fields. And there's a couple of areas that I could kind of give you cautionary examples that I know a lot about, like air pollution, grid integration of renewable power, carbon trading. But I want to ask you a question that's actually in your wheelhouse and not in my wheelhouse, which is to give you a fair chance to sort of reassure me a little bit about my skepticism, and that's about buildings. You mentioned it in response to one of the questions there. And in your book, you talk just a little bit about it, and you talk mainly about the targets. You just mentioned them again. And then you talked about some example buildings. And the one building that you talk about a lot in your book, I've visited too. It's this Agenda 21 building. It's a LEED gold standard building. It was very impressive. For all I know, it remains very impressive. But I've been to other sort of showpiece green buildings in China 5 years or 10 years after they were built, and they're falling apart. The systems aren't working. They didn't live up to their design. You know, even the people who are working in them, who are often environmental researchers or environmental officials, acknowledge this. They say, oh, this building isn't what it was supposed to be. And more importantly, I mean, in general in the buildings industry, it seems like you see very, very little evidence of very highly energy efficient buildings. You see very little evidence of the retrofits that you mentioned. Now, maybe I'm not seeing it. This is anecdotal for me. But I'm wondering, like, what sort of systematic information there is, survey-based information, that actually shows that China's building infrastructure, which is very, very important to carbon emissions going forward, it's a big component in any country in the world, is actually living up to what the law requires and what the rhetoric suggests. And this is particularly important given the mass urbanization that China is undertaking now.
Very good point, Chris. The law is still weak. It doesn't require 50% of China's new buildings to be green certified. If it did, it would be green certified under China's 3-star system, not the LEED Green Building Development System, not US state energy efficiency standards. So that's the first problem. Second problem is something that China found out when trying to improve the efficiency of its industry, which is it started out with the big polluters, the big energy efficiency, the big energy intensive industries, the top 1,000 program. And it found a lot of success in improving energy efficiency with the top 1,000 factories. Then it moved to the top 10,000. A little bit more difficult, but still some real successes. The problem now is, what about the hundreds of thousands of small and medium enterprises that collectively produce tons of emissions and are very energy inefficient? We're trying to tackle that. On the industrial side, it is so much harder because there is a huge number of small sources. I would make that analogy to buildings. There's some very big buildings, high-profile buildings that are pretty high-quality, zero-emission showcase buildings. However, I think you're right about the planned obsolescence of Chinese buildings everywhere. I remember my colleague Alex Wan telling me that friends of his were amazed that he lived in a building that was 4 years old, because it was an apartment building in Beijing, because it was so old. It's just planned obsolescence. So that's an issue here, because when you look at the embedded energy of these buildings, if you're going to tear it all down and build it up again, who cares how efficient it is? We also worked on the Beijing Olympics to try and green the bird's nest back in 2008. So yes, they put in LED lighting, but there was so much steel to be used in the construction of that one, that if you look at the total energy use, it was really high. So this is a serious problem in China. We've been working on it in Shanghai, where the government of the district that is the most Chongqing district, which is the most developed one in Shanghai, maybe in the country. They got a huge grant and program from the World Bank to make the buildings in Shanghai more energy efficient. People didn't want to take the money. They were getting nowhere. And they came to us, and what we have tried to do is to try and develop a market for energy efficient buildings. It's not enough just to have command and control. We see that that doesn't work in China. So one of the things we've done is to try and promote the use of building energy benchmarking, which New York City Mayor Bloomberg did with such great effect. And in fact, what is building energy benchmarking? It's when you get information about a building's energy use and you make it available to the public. In fact, Chongqing District did last year pass the first building energy benchmarking regulation in China, but they don't want to make the data available to the public. And I should say, when I lived in Hong Kong, we tried the same thing. Hong Kong also didn't want to make that building energy benchmarking information available to the public. They wanted to catch it and look it over themselves first and see what they could do. But it's a huge uphill battle. That's why I was thinking, if you tie it to the green jobs industry and really get serious about training people to do this, there's always a lack of capacity. I should tell you another story to show the difficulties. And this was 10 years ago in Shanghai. We worked with this local research institute to develop a simplified method for assessing a building's energy efficiency. Because at that point, and unfortunately still today, there were a few building efficiency experts who would charge an arm and a leg to do an audit of your building and to tell you how to make it more energy efficient. But this new software that we adapted with this research institute for China's purposes was simplified. So it didn't get it exactly right, but it was free. It's being used freely by US EPA, anybody who wants it. So we did that, we developed it, and then when we went back, we said, well, how are you using this software? They were charging for it, just as much as these other experts would have charged. There's your building energy efficiency market.
Hi, my name's Elena Peng. Actually, we've met before in the space of 2011 to 2014 in the NRDC Beijing offices. You quoted one research paper that you wrote with my mother. Yeah, Wang Yan's my mother, and that's why I'm here. Yes.
She heads our environmental governance program in China.
Right. Okay. I'm not a law student myself, and I want to make that clear.
It's okay.
But what do you think what do you think are the main contributors to the lack of coverage of environmental news in Chinese mainstream media? Because if they do mention it, it is a byline, which is incongruent because all media firms are state-run, and since they've made it a priority, why would they then make it a byline? Especially, I remember my mother was heading this program for citizen suits back in 2014, 2013, you would know, in Anhui, and it was the first successful citizen suit, and there was absolutely zero coverage of it, which I found quite bizarre. I looked through local media, I looked through everything, and well, here's a personal anecdote, maybe that might help contextualize it. Back before she worked for the NRDC, and she was an environmental lawyer before she worked for the NRDC. And journalists would call our house phone before we had cell phones. They would call our house all the time. And so what she taught, and this is the way I learned to answer the phone growing up. I learned to answer with no comment in Chinese. 无评论 for anybody else. I learned to answer the phone with no comment instead of hello. So what do you think are the main contributors to the lack of state media coverage?
You know, I have seen that also change over the years. And I would think it's probably in recent years a reflection of larger issues and the, restrictions on discussions and the press in general in China. I would also think that with respect to local government issues, what you've got, and I talk about this in the book, is this resistance from very powerful vested interest, whether it be the local government, whether it be fossil fuel industry, whether it be chemical companies that have a spill. I think that's what you're seeing. I think that's probably behind a lot of it. But I do agree with you that there is a tremendous role that the media can play in China, just like in any other country, to publicize these, disasters and to help develop the response. So yeah, there's it's not as robust as it once was. Barbara, one more question.
Thank you. So on the question of reducing emissions, in addition to moving to renewable energy, we also probably should use less energy where possible. And if we have better cities where people have to commute less, and if we have more public transport, so not everybody drives a car, but if you're on a bus, economies of scale, it means less energy consumption. So on that score, where do you place China? What's your assessment of how it's doing and where it's headed going forward?
Another great question. As Chris mentioned, China is undergoing the most rapid and massive urbanization in human history. Buildings are going up on green fields, farmland, and so forth. I'm afraid that China has adopted many of our worst examples of sprawl. However, it is trying to, in many cases, and again, it's a question of leadership, and it depends on city mayors. There are at least 20 to 30 cities that have pledged to peak their CO2 emissions faster than the government target of 2030. And of course, when the major urban centers, building use, transportation are the key sources of CO2 emissions. That's why I'm so heartened that China has developed electric buses and made them competitive price-wise with conventional buses already. But you're right, the design of cities is key. Walkability is one area. We have produced a report on, again, about 30 to 40 cities each year on how well they are walkable. And that's something you don't see very often. But that's the best form of transportation. If you can have people living close to where they work and shop and do their business, then you don't have any transportation at all. And so again, there is some progress here, but it's not as fast as I would like to see it. There's been some spectacular examples of smart cities that have not been successful because in large part the developers did not consult with the local community to see what they really want and need. Just kind of put it down there and said, here you go. So again, it's a question of transparency, of bringing stakeholders together, of working with the local community. I'd say China is making some progress here, but still has a long way to go. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.